Alright, so it's time to start up the third assignment, and it's going to be a little bit of a change of pace in comparison to the last two assignments. And what I mean by that is the last two assignments we were busy keyframing stuff, animating things, just getting used to working with cameras, working with materials and stuff for the first time. Well, we're going to take those two skills kind of to the next level, and in order to do that, we're going to sort of take a break from animating, just because in order to learn 3D and get a really solid understanding of it, it's, in my opinion, better to sort of do some stuff one step at a time. And I think it's time for us to level up our rendering and material and lighting game. Those are all sort of the same umbrella of tasks, making stuff look good, like the actual object or the actual composition of the project you're turning in. So we're gonna forego keyframes for a little bit, like I said, and our assignment is going to be a product of some sort. This is a pretty important part of working in the industry, is being able to develop something in 3D. If you're going to be going into the 3D field, obviously, making something and making it look nice. Because we can animate stuff all day long, we do have to focus on making stuff look really good. So we're going to be turning in one still frame, so that'll be like a JPEG or a PNG instead of a movie file. And what that will be some sort of product. And what do I mean by that? Well, that is open for interpretation. I am going to be going over making like a sort of a craft beer advertisement. So I'm going to be making a bottle and a can and some sort of like wooden kind of desk. You could reinterpret the word product to be some sort of beauty product, like a shampoo or some sort of cosmetic thing. You could reinterpret it to be any number of other objects that you can imagine, possibly something branded. You could do like a Coca-Cola bottle and try to make it look like a still, that would be like in a magazine of an advertisement of some sort. And we're gonna try to make these look in the ballpark of photorealistic. We're gonna get as close to that as we can by adding stuff like depth of field, and we're gonna learn some more about texturing. So let's jump into that. Well, obviously, the first thing that we want to do, like in other projects, but even more important now, is our reference images. If we are going to be recreating a photograph of some sort, which is what I'm going to be sort of replicating, I really, really want to stress how important getting good photograph reference is. So we'll jump into Google, and I could just go to Google and type craft beer and go to images, and I can find some stuff. And craft beer is kind of an example that I've learned, having done this a couple times. This will yield some good results. For example, this image here, this is a little bit more involved, but it demonstrates some of the photographic techniques such as depth of field. And that is how some portions of the image are in focus, in this case our subject, the glass, and other parts of the image are out of focus. The background here with the light or some sort of window, and then these other taps sort of closer to camera. And what this is doing is it's drawing your eye into a specific portion of this image. It's directing you, the viewer, at what the advertiser wants you to be seeing. So I am going to refine my search a little bit. So I'm going to type craft beer bottle photography. Again, I have done this a handful of times, and my pro tip is to add the word photography or photograph if you are looking up a specific thing. You could even look up cosmetic ad, and we could find something like this bottle, this right here could be an example of a different sort of product that you could, potentially model, or this. So again, exercise a little bit of imagination here in picking a subject, again, a subject that will interest you. If you've taken any of the, I think it's one of the advanced page layout or advanced Illustrator classes, possibly, where you make some sort of like personal branding. I know a student in a former semester had made their own sort of mock like line of like brewery products and stuff, so she had her own set of labels that she wanted to use as the beer bottle labels, and that was a really awesome example of using work from outside of this class, but still in the MACA umbrella, and putting it to use in this. So I'm going to grab a couple of these images, and we're going to save some of these photographs, hopefully, to our reference. And this is another time to start thinking about composition. Definitely try to gather as many photograph references as you can. What I'm seeing here a lot of is wide shots of multiple bottles showing off multiple labels, in the sense of like a brewery or an entire brand of craft beer. In this case, they would want to show their whole product line from all of the different flavors and stuff. And so this is obviously a reoccurring theme I'm seeing here in these search results. So put some of these things to use, kind of start training your brain on picking up on stuff like this. And even when it comes to modeling additional things, such as other supporting elements that aren't necessarily the product itself, but other related things, maybe ingredients, other commonly used items or whatever, start getting this stuff in mind. Okay, so I've got a handful of these images of some bottles, so I'm going to start saving these out, and before I do that, I need to make myself a folder, obviously, for this third assignment. So out of the collection of ones that have caught my eye, I think I like this one the most in terms of composition, so I'm going to sort of, I think this is going to be the one that I'm going to shoot for in terms of trying to recreate, but I'm going to take some of the elements from these other images as inspiration. I sort of like the arrangement of this one, how these different bottles aren't just lined up in a row, they're sort of staggered in Z space, sort of how close some of them are versus how back others are, and also their sizes is kind of interesting. And then this one, I like the top of this one. So definitely grab some ideas from a handful of different photos. If you are sort of jumping around, if your inspiration is sort of varied, combine elements from each image. I would wholeheartedly recommend doing that. So while we're, I guess, getting started, The way that we are going to model this object is going to require, or at least the way that I'm going to show it, is going to require us to look up a sort of line drawing or some sort of a diagram of a bottle. And what I mean by that is I can look up So I'm going to look up a beer bottle line drawing, because what I'm looking for is some sort of image like this that almost looks like it's been illustrated, because we are going to use the pen tool in Cinema 4D, not to draw this, like to directly trace it out. We'll be tracing half of it, and then we're going to use one of our tools that we have in our toolbox to then create the entire object. In the case of this bottle, we would sort of start at the middle point and draw our way around, and then we'll see. So I'm going to look for a shape of a bottle that I like. Just real quick, see if any of them catch my eye. Obviously, with a bottle, there are a near infinite amount of variety of shapes and proportions. But I like this one. I like this middle one. This is a shape that I haven't done before. So I'm going to, I think, follow this one. And it's also even giving me an illustration or information about what shape I could make the label in potentially. So I'm going to grab this one as well. So jumping into Cinema now, let's get going, because we're already 12 minutes in. So we are going to hit middle mouse button and jump to our front camera here in the lower right. And much like how we started the title animation where we're loading in a reference image, we're going to do that of that line drawing so that we can begin to draw this bottle. So to load that in, again, once we are in our front camera, we hit Shift V on our keyboard, and then we want to go over here to the back tab, and this is where we load our image. So we will go to our folder here where we have our line drawing and bring this in. Cool. So here's our drawing. I just want to kind of check the scale that this came in at, because I'm just curious. So okay. So this is the size of a default cube. I'm pretty happy with how big that bottle looks in comparison, so I'm just going to delete that. Another important part of this process of using a reference, a line work reference, is we need to center, or it's going to make our lives easier to center this image, because we see here this green vertical line. Might be difficult to tell it on the projector, but it's this line here. This is off-center from this middle bottle. So I want to, here in my back settings, right where I loaded in my image, I want to offset this image. In this case, I want to offset it left and right, which is X. So I'm going to offset it. Now, I'm never going to get it perfectly centered, because this is most likely a drawing, and who knows, how perfect the proportions are, blah, 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 blah. If you are following a photograph, it's possible that that photograph has some sort of perspective or angle, possibly where the object isn't directly straight on. So just do your best to kind of try to line it up in the middle, but I'm pretty satisfied with where that is now. So I can get to work with the spline tool, or the pen tool, sorry. So we're going to click pen, and for now I want to make sure that the type is on Bezier, so that's cool. And I'm going to start down at the bottom of the bottle. So starting at the middle point, I'm just going to kind of draw along and work my way through here. This is pretty standard pen tool stuff, so if you're a whiz at the pen tool, then maybe just breeze on by here for a second. Pretty straightforward. I'm just simply left clicking to place a point in holding ever so slightly to pull out these Bezier handles. You know, it's pretty standard pen tool stuff. We went over some of it in the Illustrator portion of the last assignment. So I'm going to do my best to try to work the sort of shape of this lip here at the end of the bottle. Again, I'm not going to get it perfect, and once we get into this portion that has the bottle cap, it's going to be difficult for me to know how high up to go, but I'm just going to kind of give it my best guess. So now that I've drawn it upwards, we probably think we're done, but in the case of a bottle that has an open top, we aren't done. And I don't have a bottle with me to show as a reference, but here we go, thank you. So this is a pop bottle. Apologize for anyone listening to the lecture or the recorded video, but if we look at this bottle, if we imagine this as glass, which would be a little bit thicker than this plastic, we want to imagine that we have sort of the outer shape, but then also inside the bottle we also have the inner shape as well. So it's almost like it has two layers, is how we want to think about it. So now that I've drawn my pathway up the bottle, up to the top, I now need to work my way back down along the inside of the bottle. And that'll be very important for anything that needs to look like glass, or which is going to probably encompass most, if not all of the products that people will come up with. Something bottle-shaped that will contain your object, whether it's some sort of drink or other whatever. You need to follow this set of instructions. So we're basically just going to trace our way back through the inside of this bottle. One thing I do want to point out, with the lip here, the lip wouldn't follow along the inside, or at least I don't have any reference here telling me if I need to or not, so I'm just going to kind of skip by that one little detail. But for the most part, I'm just going to kind of follow the points that I've already put in place and just sort of trace my way back down this bottle. While you're doing this, I wouldn't worry too much about making a mistake with the pen tool. You know, if you kind of mess up and misclick something, most likely you'll be able to go back and change it afterwards. So just sort of make a mental note if you feel like you screwed up. And while I get down to the bottom here, in the case of a bottle like this, I do want to point out that there would be a little bit of an indentation in the bottom. So I'm not going to draw straight sort of horizontally across. I'm going to give myself a little bit of a bump. So that way the bottom of the bottle, which provides a little bit of structure to the glass in this case, is not going to be sort of immediately down next to its kind of partner. So once I've traced along my path, I can hit escape to sort of close out of the pen tool. And if I go to my front camera, well, we have sort of a bottle looking shape. This would be sort of called a cross section, if you're familiar with other sort of drawing terms. But one thing I do want to point out is while we are in here, we need to make sure that the anchor point of this object is set up right. So the anchor point is currently on the axis, basically the middle of the project. If you did not center your drawing here, you will want to move your anchor point. But before we actually get about to moving the anchor point, I want to double check these points. So this is the bottom, the very, very, very bottommost point of what I've drawn. And we can see here, if I select that point and I go to this coordinate, on the x coordinate, which is in this case is the one that we're looking for because this is the red direction, I can see that this point is not at 0. It's at negative 0.2 blah blah blah. So I want to select that point and hit 0 because it's very important for the way that this tool that we are about to use, in order for it to work, we have to have these points be at 0. So I'm going to do that to this other corresponding point, and that should take care of that. Because this bottle doesn't come to the center point at the top, because it's going to leave us an opening, you'll see shortly, I don't have to worry about the top points up here. But in the case of something like a can, if you were to be doing an aluminum can, you would have a different shape. You would have points that would correspond to the center up at the top. So that's enough blabbering. Let's actually make our bottle. So this might seem like it was quite a bit of setup, but trust me, we will be making the bottle very, very quickly. And when I say very, very quickly, I mean almost literally with one button. And that one button here is the lathe. So the lathe is in this first screen menu, which is where our friend the extrude object lies. So I'm going to be holding Alt when I make this lathe, and it will put the bottle as a child of the lathe, and bam, I have a bottle. So just like that, bottle's done. End of the lecture. No, I'm kidding. But you can see very quickly we have this bottle, and there's really not a whole lot that I have to do to the shape of the bottle itself, because if I check my reference photo, I believe well, it's just the line. It's just this one. Oopsie daisy. So this is, you know, this is the shape that we were expecting to get. This sort of a little bit thicker of a neck here. If you are more familiar with just sort of domestic shaped bottles, this is probably a more familiar shape, but this is the shape that I went with, just whatever. And so, you know, this is going to be what my bottle looks like. One thing I do want to point out is the bottom here. If you don't do the thing where I said you need to make sure the points are all the way down at 0, if you didn't do that, you will be left with a little bit of a hole here. And if we come into the bottle, we'll see, oh hey, there's like a hole here at the bottom. That's no good. So we want to make sure that that point, in the case of the front camera, we want to make sure that the points at the bottom are at 0 on X, and we can see if we look into the bottle through the opening at the top, we have an inside, all cool, awesome. So if you were doing a can as well as a bottle, you would want to find a reference photo of a can. You know, maybe, or just making up an example, if you wanted to do like Coca-Cola or whatever, you could do like the cool, awesome bottled Coke, but then also do a can of Coke next to it or whatever. That would be pretty cool. But in my case, I'm going to be making the bottle and then making some other supporting kind of visual elements or whatever. I'm not just going to be only making bottles and cans. So that's what I'm going to do. But I'll show some other stuff, obviously. At some point we'll be putting liquid into this bottle, and we'll be making the cap for the bottle and all that fun stuff. But you know, we'll get there when we get there. One thing, I think the next thing I want to go over, do I want to get into making the label? That's a good question. I think I will. So I think I'm going to do that. So I'm going to search up a label. So let's look up beer bottle label. So I'm going to see if I can find some sort of design or whatever. One thing that is cool, obviously, as our skills in Illustrator and Photoshop, is we can design some sort of brand or logo. We also know how to touch up or maybe alter a design or logo that we find if we're just jumping off something from Google. But I kind of like this thing. This is kind of a cool logo, although I know the resolution of this 475 by 475 is going to be pretty small. So I'm going to do the trick on Google where we filter large images, and I'm going to try to find a different logo. So that's kind of cool. It's also on, yeah, so it's from Wikipedia. It's kind of a good sized image. So that might work. That might work. If we are finding something, we're going to want to avoid something with watermarks. This has watermarks from this website, so that's going to be a no-go for me. So I think I'm just going to go with this first one. This is pretty cool, and I can cut out this relatively simply in Photoshop to give myself an alpha channel when it comes to it. So we're going to open this image in a new tab. Cool. And we're going to save this. So I'm going to make my text folder. Again, this is what we want to make sure that we are putting our textures into. And this will be bottle label base. That's just what I'm going to call that. So before I get into the next step of Cinema 4D, I'm just going to cut this out in Photoshop because I know that in this case Photoshop is going to be the program that I'm going to use for this next step along the way. So while Photoshop opens, I'm just going to save my project because I've not yet done that, which is a shame. So Photoshop is almost about loaded up. So close. Okay, so we're going to open up our image. And just as a little primer, or maybe a reminder, or whatever, here in Photoshop, I've got my layers over here on the bottom right. I want to double click this first layer because it imports as a locked layer, which is no good for me because I need to do a little bit of editing to cut out this label, because this is the sort of label that would be affixed onto the bottle alone, most likely. Some bottles or some labels will wrap all the way around. If I hold up my trusty example here, this label travels all the way around the bottle, which is the way that some labels are designed. Others will just be a portion on the front or maybe a portion on the back. In the case of bottles, like beer bottles, another very common thing is to have some sort of logo or emblem or whatever along the neck of the bottle. This is a good example. So also keep that sort of thing in mind. I don't have anything to go off of with the one image I have as far as a label on the neck goes, so I'm just going to omit that for now. But jumping back into Photoshop here, I need to start using my pen tool. So I'm going to grab my pen tool and I'm going to cut out this logo. Shouldn't take me too long. Again, if you screw up, you can obviously always go back and make tweaks. You don't have to get it right on the first try. Oopsie daisy. So that's pretty close. I do know that I'm not exactly on in some sections, so I'm going to move these and tweak these. Just because the better that I do this, or the more accurate I am, the less problem I'll have in the future. When it comes time to applying this label, I'm not going to want a weird white section of pixels kind of attached to the side of my logo. So I'm going to kind of cheat on the inside of this border ever so slightly. But don't worry if you are making your own piece of artwork or you're finding a label that wraps all the way around. This isn't necessarily a step that you have to take, but I do in my case. So I'm just going to do this, work my way around. Okay, so that's pretty close. I can go to my paths, select my path, and then make, I should probably go over that a little bit just because I know that not everyone's going to be a whiz at masks in Photoshop. I drew out a path, so let me just deselect this. I drew out my path. I went to the paths channel over here. I'm going to hold Control when I click this icon here that says Work Path. This will give me a selection. We can see here the little marching ants moving around. So then I can come back to Layers over here, and with my bottle label selected, I can make a mask, which is this icon here, the square with the little hole in the center. It says Add Mask. And then there we go. I've got my label cut out. I have an alpha channel in the back, which is going to be important because it will just be this oval logo affixed to my bottle. It won't have the white rectangle junk applied to the side of it, which is not going to be what I want. So I can save as a PSD, and I'm going to call this bottle label texture. We'll get back to this soon. So this next part of what we are going to be working in Cinema is called UV mapping. We've done a little bit of stuff that uses the UV tag. In the first assignment, when we were working with a sort of a wooden texture, we were using different ways to move that UV tag around, but as we learned, it was a little cumbersome, and if we had something really specific in mind, it could be hard to pull off. So the way to get around those problems that we ran into then is going to be using the following steps called UV mapping, and this is a really, really important part of 3D. It is going to allow us to put a shape, in this case our image, our texture of this label, exactly onto the bottle, exactly where we want. This is a really important part of the sort of game development process and just almost anything in 3D. If I look up what a UV map is, we're going to see, this is a good example. So this is our 3D character here, this image on Google. It is a little knight, and he has these different pieces of armor, and we see on these different pieces of armor we have different colors, different painted parts of this texture, and over here on the right we see this weird sort of layout of all these shapes, but these shapes are the texture that is being applied to this object. This is, over here on the right, a 2D representation of a 3D image. This is what a UV map is. If that previous sentence sort of doesn't make much sense, an easy way to visualize this is a bearskin rug. If you've ever seen one in like a movie or whatever, you see the bearskin rug laid out flat. Well, that is obviously something that came off of a 3D object, a bear, right? It is a flat, laid out version of something that used to be in 3D. So we see in some cases, these are making some sort of weird shapes of these different sort of curves and characteristics of this helmet, for example. But in our case, a bottle is one of the most simple ways to get an introduction into UV mapping. If I were to pull off, for example, if I peeled off this label from this bottle here, we would see this label would sort of look like a rectangular piece of paper, maybe kind of about this big. But that is being put onto a 3D shape via kind of a cylinder sort of layout. So let's just jump into Cinema and start kind of working with that. So here I've got my bottle, and I want to name it. So I've got my bottle, and in this case I'm going to want to keep a copy of a lot of the objects that I make, because what we have to do is make them editable, and if for whatever reason I need to go back and tweak the shape of this bottle or whatever, I want my original sort of still in the file. So I'm going to make a null and just call it backup. I usually actually call this like old. So I'll put the old little group. I'm going to turn the little dots to red, so that way I know anything that's going in there, it'll be in my project, but it'll be hidden. I don't have to worry about seeing it or messing it up. So I'm going to make my copy. You can copy and paste or whatever into the old folder. So cool, I've got a backup of this bottle. I am now able to make this editable. And we see I've made it editable, and we can go to polygon mode, and we have this. So we have our bottle, and you can start to see already now, you can visualize where I'm going to want to place this bottle. Sort of, if I use my loop selection, this is basically the ballpark of where I want to put this label. And when you make your object, whatever shape, size, whatever it is, you will also begin to visualize where this label is going to go. So with that being said, I've got this piece selected, and this is going to sort of benefit me in the next step. I need to change my layout up here in the upper right hand corner from what it is on currently. I want to change it to BP UV edit. For me, it's the third one in the list, and we'll see a bunch of stuff changed. The layout of the program looks significantly different, but don't fret. We have our viewport here, and moving around in the viewport is the same. If you use Alt and the mouse buttons, or 1, 2, and 3, whatever, however you move around, here you go. We also have our objects list, which is down here in the lower left hand corner now. And if you don't see anything over here in the upper right, this is what I call the UV space, or the UV viewport. You want to make sure that your object is selected. So I've got my object selected, and just as an example, just in case if you don't see anything up here, you want to select your object, and then this checkered tag, which is next to our object, we've seen this, but we've kind of glossed over it for the most part. You want to click and drag that right up here, and you'll see a grid up here, which is cool. So how do I get back to my selection? Well, we're used to model select, polygon select, etc. We're used to them being over here on the left, but they're now over here in the upper middle. So I want to get back to my polygon selection, and I'm going to use UL to select this segment, which is where I want my label to be. And we can see over here on the right, this is a representation of where in 2D, in the UV map, this orange highlighted section corresponds to the polygons that we have selected here. And if I add more selection, you'll see slowly, just because of the way that these are shaped kind of by default, we'll see that more things are going to appear over here on the right. So if you need to modify your selection as far as where you want to apply your label, you want to do that beforehand. Because as we get into this next series of steps, I recommend kind of doing this one step at a time, but trying to follow the step exactly as I'm doing it. And I'm going to go over this very slowly, so that way as we get into this in the video, as you're working through it on your own time, hopefully we'll run into as few hang-ups as possible, because this is a big departure from the way that we're used to working. And I know it can be a challenging thing to wrap our heads around. So we'll see that this shape here doesn't really correspond much to over here. And the reason for that is because currently by default our UVs aren't really representative of our shape. And we can verify that by making a new material. And we're going to just put a really simple checker, like a checkerboard or chessboard pattern, onto this bottle, just for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to create a new material. And I know this layout is a little bit different. So this is the shader. I'm going to double click right down here to open up my material window. This should feel familiar. So here in the texture, instead of loading an image or loading currently that label that I made in Photoshop, we're not ready for that. I want to click the little arrow, and we're going to go down to Surfaces, Checkerboard. And we'll see a checkerboard appears here in the material preview. But I just know ahead of time these checkers are going to be a little bit too big to show or to demonstrate visually what I want to demonstrate. So I'm going to click the thumbnail here to go into this checkerboard setting, and I'm going to increase the frequency to 5 by 5. And we'll see that the checkers are much smaller and more repetitive. So that'll make my life a little bit easier in a moment. So I'm just going to go back to model mode real quick because I want to apply this material to my whole bottle, and I'm going to do that by right-clicking and then hitting apply. So pretty straightforward. You know, we're used to dragging and dropping the materials. You can do that if you'd like, but we can see that we had a checkerboard here. These checkers are square. They're even on each side, width and height, but here on the bottle they're not showing up like that. They're showing up as rectangles, tall rectangles actually. And the reason for that is because these are being stretched. Our UVs over here on the right are, again, they're not indicative of what this bottle, what we are imagining this bottle should look like. So we need to make some changes. So this is how to UV map kind of from start to finish, the following steps. We want to get back to our polygon selection, which in my case is going to be the section that I want my label. Again, and this corresponds to these polygons over here. So with the case of a bottle, if you are going to be applying a label, we have to think in the real world. The label is applied to the outside of the bottle and not the inside of the bottle. Like if I take the cap off and if we look into the inside of the bottle here, sure, we can see the label from the inside, but that's because it's see-through. The label's not actually applied on the inside of the bottle. So I want to make sure that I'm only going to be UV mapping the outside of the bottle. And the easiest way to do that is to select this one portion, which is what we want. Now, you could kind of do it the silly way and select all of these other sections of polygons, but it would take you all day to select this whole bottle except for this one string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invert my selection. Obviously that's a shortcut. So invert is under the U menu. So we can see here on our list I is for invert. So this inverts my selection, and we can see that all of the polygons except for my label are now what is selected. And we see that change represent over here, which is cool. So we might think that over here we want to start maybe using the scale tool or the move tool or whatever, but not quite. There is a key distinction to make. These selection menus, these are the actual polygons of our object, but these two, this UV polygon and UV points, these are what we actually want to move when it comes to UV mapping. So we want to select the UV polygons and not the actual polygons, and over here is where we can use our scale tool, just T. So we can click and drag, and we can scale down the section that is not the label. So if you're following along, you want to again sort of identify where you want your label to be, and then invert your selection. And once you invert your selection, this is all of the glass portion of my bottle. I want to scale it essentially down to nothing. There's not an easy way to scale it literally to 0, but this tiny little ant-sized shape is good enough. So then I'm going to use my move tool, just E, and I'm going to drag it down into the little corner. Now, one thing I do want to point out, here in the UV space, or the UV viewport, we have a gray box that is, you know, fairly visible here. This is our boundary. If you think of, you know, if it's your Photoshop canvas or whatever, you don't want to go outside of the bounds of this canvas. For right now, just kind of follow that and take that advice. Obviously, you know, some rules are meant to be broken, but not in this case. Do as I say. So I can get back to my label by inverting again, U, I. And now that we have this label, we can begin to resize this so that it will show our label, or in this case our checker, a little bit more appropriately. So we can scale it, but we want to scale it using the non-uniform scale tool. So if we just hit T on our keyboard, it's going to switch us to the scale tool. That's not the one we want. We want the non-uniform scale tool. And this will allow us, if we click and hold, to scale. In this case, I'm moving my mouse sort of downwards, sort of, you know, in a straight line as best as I can. It's not a perfect technique, but I want to start to resize these rectangles or checkers so that they look square and not rectangular. Because if they are rectangular, what that means is it's going to be distorting our Photoshop image. Just like we saw when we made this material, we know that these are supposed to look like squares. But if they look like rectangles, what that means is you're stretching out those squares, either horizontally or vertically, and that's going to distort your image. You don't want that. And if you're working on a job, your client doesn't want that. They don't want their logo stretched and to look like crap. So it's important to get this right. So this is pretty close. There's not a really awesome way to eyeball it, but there are some tricks that we can go over in a little bit later. But this is pretty close. I think I'm a little bit too wide. So we're pretty close here. Now, if we jump back to this Google image, I want to point out how well of this sort of canvas this UV map is using. It's almost using the whole thing kind of to the best of its ability. Whereas currently, my example is using a very small portion. So what I want to do is now I want to scale this whole thing back up, this time uniformly, and I want to enlarge this so that I'm making a little bit more efficient use of my workspace. You know, if you were painting a new, or if you were painting something in Photoshop, if I made a new document and Photoshop's freaking out, geez, whatever. If we were using this Photoshop document, we wouldn't want to only draw in the corner. We would want to try to draw using the whole canvas. So that's basically what I'm trying to say. So this is pretty close. This is fairly large, and my scale is looking pretty good. Again, I can always tweak it further later. But this is the next, or this is the last step. We've essentially UV mapped our simple shape, our cylinder, and we're ready to move on to the next step. So moving on to the next step is a kind of tricky process. Sometimes it can be easy to mess up. So I would recommend watching this next section all the way through, and then going back and then doing it, because it's easy to mess up, and as far as I'm aware of, Cinema wants you to set this up kind of in one go, and you don't want to like mess anything up because it can make your life harder. So step one is to click File here on the UV menu, and we're going to make a new texture, and I'm going to call this Bottle UV. So that's going to be the name of the file. I can raise this width and height. A 1000 resolution image is okay, but I know my Google the one that I found on Google was like in the 1500s range, so I want to make this at least larger than that. And typically, when we're working with computers, we work in multiples of the number 8, and in this case, the multiple that I'm looking for is 2048. That is double what the value was by default. And I'm going to change this color to black. Okay, so that was step 1. Step 2 is clicking layer, and creating a UV mesh layer. So it is a little tricky to see just because of the way that the computer is demonstrating this on a smaller resolution monitor, but we see some of these white lines. Now mind you, I have not clicked anything. Once I made that, I'm only moving my mouse. It's really important to not kind of like click off of stuff or to try to move anything. This is a sort of touchy process, like I said, but we can start to see this white grid, and that's a good sign. I don't see all of it, but I'm seeing some of it, so just trust me. If you see some of it, that's a good thing. So now I want to click File, Save. So it's going to ask me what format. A TIFF is fine. So I'm going to put it into my folder, and we're going to go into my text folder, and here's my bottle UV. Cool. So we're going to save that, and now jumping back to Photoshop, we can verify that that file worked. So now if you are watching the video, now you can go back and repeat that process on your own. It's just important to click through those menus and to enable those settings kind of right, sort of step by step, and work your way through it, and then you can move on. So let's open that. Here's my bottle UV. And sometimes, okay, cool, this worked. All right, so I didn't screw it up. Sometimes I do, but we can see here we have our black layer, which is that first layer that we made, and then we have a UV mesh layer, which in this case is a white grid representation of our UV map. Awesome. This is that second step that we did. And this is going to be where I want to apply my label. So within this boundary here, this is sort of the whole UV space. I have designated this portion to be where I want to place my label. So I'm going to jump back over to this previous file that I've made. You can import, if you are working kind of in a different process, you can bring whatever layer you have in, but I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to use this menu here to send this current layer over to the bottle UV document, which is this tab over here. So cool. I have my label, and I can use my move tool to move this, and I'm just going to try to center it up. That looks close enough. Cool. So I am ready to save out this and see what it looks like in Cinema. Now it's important to, at least in my case, because I have a label that isn't the whole bottle, I want to turn off these backgrounds so that way I'm on alpha. Cool. So I'm going to File, Save As, and I can save as a TIFF or a PNG, something that will retain an alpha channel. PNG I know should work. If not, you know, we can always make changes, but whatever. Can hit save, blah, blah, blah. So over here, back in Cinema, we're going to make our actual label material. So we're going to make a new material, and I'm going to call this label. Double click to get into it. We know the drill here. We're going to load in that label that we just made for ourselves. And then we want to apply this to these polygons. So over here, I've switched back to polygon mode, and then with this selection, I'm going to drag this label onto this bottle. Sweet. Awesome. The label's sideways. This will usually happen. I would probably wager that it'll happen to most people, but it's no big deal. All we have to do is simply rotate our UVs. Or we could rotate the image here in Photoshop. Either way, I'm going to do it in Cinema just so that we learn a new tool or a new command. And that is down over here in the bottom right, the transform. So the way the transform setting works is it's not like using the rotate tool or the move tool or whatever. It's basically I guess the comparison would be in Photoshop or in Illustrator if you're using the transform tool and you type in a specific size or a specific amount to rotate it. It's like working like that way. So I want to rotate it 90 degrees. So I'm going to type in 90 and then hit apply. And we'll see that it rotated that UV section 90 degrees. In my case, it worked the right way. It's possible you might have to go negative 90 to rotate it counterclockwise, whereas mine rotated clockwise or whatever. But we can see it's cutting off the top of the label a little bit. So that's no good. So what we want to do is, in this case, I'm going to scale up my UVs just a little bit. And I don't have to use the transform tool to do this. I can just use the scale tool. And again, remember we have to switch back to UV polygons to do this next command. So if I scale up these UVs a little bit, we'll see that the label will now fit within the top and bottom. And I think that's a good place to stop. We're right at about an hour, so that'll take us up through modeling our first object. Well, actually before that, identifying what our first object is going to be, finding reference for it, and then modeling it using the Lathe tool, and then UV mapping it, finally. So this is all kind of one contained from start to finish little lecture here. If you have multiple objects that are different shapes, for example, you have a can and you have a bottle, you would want to follow this whole process basically for each item, and then you'd be on your way. So I think that's a good place to stop. We will save, and we will cut this lecture right now.